Not what I would say to a 5-year-old. I was explaining to my 12-year-old the other day who said, talking about his brother, when he behaves that way, I have to respond that way. And I said, no, actually you don't. And I explained to him how this was not a stimulus-evoked behavior.
So maybe I might say something like, when you feel bad and all you can think about is feeling bad, sometimes if you can just do something else that makes you think about something completely different, it might help you feel better. I'm Elizabeth Phelps. I'm the Pershing Square Professor of Human Neuroscience at Harvard University. And I study cognitive neuroscience, specifically how emotion changes how we learn, remember, and decide.
I'm Catherine Hartley. I'm an associate professor of psychology and neuroscience at New York University. I'm a developmental cognitive neuroscientist, and I study how learning, memory, and decision-making change as the brain develops from childhood to adulthood.
So one of the things about survival circuits, particularly the defensive survival circuit that we're talking about, where there's, where you respond to threats, is that, at times that should dominate all of your behavior. But humans are unique in that we can imagine complex things, threats happening to us that never actually occur. And sometimes this can result in things like anxiety disorders or just maladaptive threat responses. And so we're interested in looking at the interplay of survival circuits, particularly defensive survival circuits, and cognitive circuits. And there's some evidence that they may sort of compete in the brain. And we want to know, can we take advantage of that competition of these different circuits in the brain to help promote more adaptive responding to threats that aren't real threats.
One facet of this research is that the subcortical circuits that govern things like defensive responses that promote survival, these circuits are functional from very early stages in development. But the connections between these subcortical systems and the cognitive systems are refined over a long period that stretches into young adulthood.
So my lab is focusing on adults and trying to isolate some of the factors that go into this competition and how we might use that to change emotional responses. And Kate's lab?
My lab is focusing on the developmental aspect of the research. And one of the things that we've found in past research is that defensive responses, when they're acquired by adolescents, are particularly robust. They remain more persistent. So one of the things that we're interested in as part of this grant is is there an alternative mechanism for diminishing the expression of defensive responses that doesn't rely upon a sort of inhibition of these responses, but instead can their expression be diminished by engaging a different system within the brain.
So we're engaging what's called cognitive load. For instance, if I set a series of numbers to you, like 5, 2, 6, 5, 3, 1, 2, right? And what I would ask you to do is keep those numbers in mind, and every time a number that appeared 2 numbers back appears, you're going to respond. This requires you to engage, to focus. Again, it's kind of difficult to do, right? Lots of people make lots of mistakes. You got to have constant attention. What's been shown is that when you do that, and when I'm sort of doing my best to really engage your cognitive circuit, I see dampened down responses in regions like the amygdala. That's important in the defensive circuit.
The ways in which this may be effective is that it's reorienting individuals' attention to internal processes and away from the threat-evoking stimulus itself.
We published one study that showed that when we did something where we did a standard, what's called threat conditioning paradigm, you now pair a neutral stimulus with an aversive event, a mild shock, you start to show threat responses to that neutral stimulus. And when we now sort of show the stimulus without any shock, people eventually will learn that the stimulus is safe. But those responses, because that kind of learning is really weak, those threat responses tend to return later on. So if we insert during that learning one of these tasks that engages cognitive load, we actually enhance that learning. And now those responses are less likely to return.
The ability to engage these types of controlled cognitive processes is relatively adult-like. in the adolescent years. So while we found that the ability to diminish defensive responses through the sorts of learning processes that Liz just spoke of is reduced in adolescence, it may be that this type of reorientation of attention toward cognitive tasks and the cognitive load that this imposes may be an alternative way to effectively diminish the expression of threat responses at that developmental stage.
Is something that has emerged in a few other areas, but not described that way. So, for instance, there's some evidence that people playing Tetris, this game Tetris, that's kind of been used in a therapeutic way in the treatment of things like PTSD, and no one really knows why. But there's some evidence it works. And also, there's something called EMDR, where you move your eyes really quickly. We think that maybe what those things have in common is that they engage cognitive load. But we don't really know if that's the case. And I would just have to say a lot of these ideas came from a postdoc who worked on this grant, Linda DeVogt. So I just want to make sure I acknowledge her. What's different about this approach is it's taking this competition between cognitive circuits and survival circuits and using that as a mechanism. Can I just engage in these cognitive tasks that, because of the way the brain's organized, is going to automatically dampen down some of these maladaptive emotional responses.
One of the standard approaches to the treatment of anxiety disorders in therapeutic contexts is exposure therapy. So if I have social phobia and I'm afraid of going to social contexts, to encourage them to go to a party, maybe bring a friend. And the idea is that by repeatedly engaging in this process, this exposure will harness these learning processes that allow defensive responses to diminish through new learning that the situation is actually safe, a process that we refer to as extinction learning. And exposure therapy is one of the currently most effective ways of treating anxiety disorders in the clinic, but it is not effective for everyone. And particularly during adolescence, because in the laboratory, we know that extinction learning is not as effective for diminishing the expression of defensive responses in adolescents as it is in adults. One of the hopes is that these alternative therapies may be more effective for the treatment of anxiety disorders during adolescence. And this is particularly important given the heightened prevalence of anxiety disorders during this stage.